what is money? Nobody can describe money because money is backed by different things in every single country of issue, and different policies and different tolerances and different risks. So there's no one definition of money. And I don't think you can definitely say that private sector is better than public sector under all conditions. I think it's a matter of local policy.
Yes, things are changing within China, especially after 2022, but still there is a certain hesitancy to take on this role of having a greater currency. But there's not too many options to have these kind of currencies that could be kind of major investment currencies.
The basic idea is that we are entering a new phase of globalization where the monopoly of the US dollar is progressively fading and for necessity is opening to a diversified and more balanced setting in the realm of international use of currencies, specifically the use of currency for trade settlement. And this will help to stabilize the world economy.
So that's why I think the transition can be stable. The one caveat to that is war changes things. War accelerates the transition because it makes people more fearful.
A rapidly growing number of countries is trading in local currencies. This offers them huge advantages while adapting to a complex world. New technological infrastructure brings new options for local credit and local corporate structures. What monetary arena is emerging? Who benefits? And can it emerge peacefully?
Welcome everybody, and thanks for watching this new video produced by Cosmolab, an initiative of the China Knowledge Network from the Dutch government, who is organizing 12 different conversations on how to manage the complexity in Chinese and Dutch and European relations. My name is Paul Buitink, I'm host of the Reinvent Money podcast, and I've been asked to moderate this session about the new international At Clearstream, she co-invented the tri-party repo market. She built CLS Bank for foreign exchange settlements, and she helped found Dubai International Financial Center. She's founder and chief executive of Pacemaker.global, a fintech to bring liquid securities finance to all currencies for a more stable transition to a multipolar global economy. Her amazing book, Multicurrency and Mercantilism, explains the transition now in progress and how it can be a win-win for everyone. After a presentation, I will moderate a panel session with Kathleen and Paolo Balmas and Johannes Petri. Paolo is a research fellow at the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research. He's an economic geographer interested in intersections of finance and geopolitics, and he's working on development banking, commercial banks, financial networks, and infrastructures. His focus now is on China's economic expansion and renminbi internationalization. Johannes is a researcher of the political economy of finance, and currently he works at the State Cap Finance Research Project at the Goethe University of Frankfurt. Building on the notion that capital markets are not uniform but influenced by the institutional environment, this project explores whether capital markets in emerging markets function differently, fulfill different socioeconomic roles, and lead to different societal outcomes than global capital markets. Welcome all. Nice to see you all, and I look forward to this engaging conversation about such a timely and important topic, the future of our financial system. Without further ado, please, Kathleen, the floor and mic is yours for your presentation first.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm working without slides today, so just going through the various points that are made in the book, which, yes, you've also already held up, but I'll do it again. And the sort of, we'll start with the history. In 1944, the United States, in the middle of World War II, had 80% of the world's gold and 50% of the world's GDP. Europe was broadly destroyed, deindustrialized. Asia destroyed, deindustrialized. The Chinese economy was overthrowing imperialism. The Soviet Union had been founded, but yet didn't have traction. And both of them suffered huge casualties. 27 million Soviets lost their lives, 35 million Chinese. So at the end of World War II, the world was very broken. Just before that, the United States convened the Bretton Woods Conference, and it essentially dictated the terms of the post-war order as being a dollar order where the dollar was fixed in value against gold, but became the sort of universal currency that everybody could use to do business. And that system worked fairly well until people started losing faith in the dollar and demanding gold be exchanged for dollars. And this was particularly France, Britain, but also others. So that by 1971, the United States' gold reserves, it had long been running twin deficits, fiscal and trade deficits. The gold reserves were broadly depleted, and in 1971, the US repudiated its responsibility to exchange dollars for gold by closing the gold window and forcing the world overnight into a system of fiat currencies that nobody was prepared for. Nobody knew how it was going to work. And it was a huge and destabilizing change. In order to stabilize that system, the new system, various things were done. One of them was the creation and enforcement of the petrodollar, that oil would only ever be sold in dollars, which created a fixed demand, a growing demand for dollars in the world and made them useful. And then also, quite importantly, the Nixon administration opened up trade with China and brought China, which had been broadly isolated after World War II. Indeed, the United States stole their reserves, blockaded their ports, and caused a huge famine into the global economy. And we've seen China's rise ever since. So now here, let's go, 2024. GDP has substantially shifted east towards Asia, which is good because that's where half of the human population is. And they need to protect themselves from an insanity that began in the United States in 1988. I actually dug out a copy of an appellate court brief I wrote when I was at the New York Fed against the extraterritorial dollar. We actually briefed against the Securities and Exchange Commission when they tried to seize dollars in an account in Singapore. We lost. And with that decision in 1988, the extraterritorial dollar became doctrine, overthrowing 400 years of banking history. Before that, you could only collect a claim on a bank account under the laws of the jurisdiction in which the claim was created. After that, every dollar was deemed to be located in New York, and the Fed could seize everyone's money anywhere in the world, anytime it wanted. And it took quite a while for the world to appreciate that this created a lot of risks. The sanctions became ever more extreme. OFAC, FATCA, expropriation of Venezuelan central bank reserves, which is a violation of international law. They were normally accorded diplomatic immunity. And of course, the 12,000 sanctions on Russia. So we now have a very different world where people are aware of the risks of trading in US dollar, and they're trying to move away from those risks into a system where they can trade with each other, have credit with each other, without the constant threat that somebody in the US Treasury Department is going to take a bleak view of it and ban them. So, going through the book chapters, the alternative to the dollar. The alternative to the dollar is the dollar and all other currencies. So the world will still do business in dollars. It's not going to stop doing business in dollars. But now it will also, in order to protect itself, particularly in goods trade and services trade, move trade into their own currencies so that they're dealing with a partner in a partner currency, and that's much less likely to be disrupted by sanctions. Stable transition. I'm a believer that I may be optimistic this week, but I'm a believer that the transition can be made stably, is being made stably. As of 2023, less than half of US trade or global trade in goods was done in US dollars. Half of it had already moved away from dollars. So, and it didn't cause any disruption. Hardly anyone noticed it because actually trade in goods is not that big. It's only about $46 trillion a year, which in the scope of our over-financialized capital markets is pretty modest. I'm just going to go through some numbers because I think it really puts in context why we can do this transition without it actually being destabilizing. So trade in goods was about 46 trillion. Half of that was US dollars, 23 trillion. If over the next 10 years, 12.5 trillion moves to other currencies, a diverse basket of other currencies, will we even notice? Probably not. It's not destabilizing. By comparison, bonds outstanding are 380 trillion, and debt market daily transactions about 1.25 trillion a day, so about 270 trillion a year. Repos and tri-party repos are about 18 trillion a day, and that means about 4,000 trillion annually. So really almost, 100% more or 1,000% more than trade in goods. Equities about 108 trillion in turnover. So it's really, derivatives, 365 trillion a year, which is huge, right? And then my favorite, because I built CLS Bank, which is the Foreign Exchange Settlement Clearinghouse. When I built it, foreign exchange transactions were only about 820 billion a day. Now they are 7.5 trillion a day on average. So that's 1,900 trillion in foreign exchange settlements each year. I don't even know what all that goes on, what it's for. I just build the plumbing. But what I do know is if 13, 14 trillion moves to goods trade in local currencies, it's very good for stabilizing vulnerable economies because they're dealing in their own currency or a partner currency. But it hardly impacts the global capital markets at all. So that's why I think the transition can be stable. The one caveat to that is war changes things. War accelerates the transition because it makes people more fearful. And we see this already. Donald Trump tweeting last week that he was going to put 100% tariffs on anybody using a BRICS currency. There is no BRICS currency. The BRICS keep saying they're not going to have a currency. He clearly hasn't been reading their reports like I have. So, but it shows the sort of level of paranoia that he could even be afraid of that. Next point, no new hegemon. China keeps saying, President Xi keeps saying, has been saying for a very long time, China has not in its 5,000-year history ever been hegemonic. It doesn't want to be hegemonic now. It's not planning on running huge trade surplus deficits. It only runs surpluses. So it's not going to be a new hegemon in the world. It is a big currency. And the amount of trade going through the Chinese payment system, CIPS, has been growing very steadily. So globalization accelerates. Now, there was a great fear that if the world divided into currency blocks, dollar and non-dollar blocks, that the global economy would shrink, would destabilize. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, the United States has sanctioned 40% of global GDP now. If that 40% of global GDP finds a way to do business in other currencies, it grows and accelerates globalization, grows and accelerates the global economy. And we see this most clearly with Russia and China, where more than 95% of their trade from 1922 has moved into renminbi and ruble. And so they're only using local currency trade for the most part. And that stabilizes them. It stabilizes Russia's role in the global economy. And it protects China from dollar sanctions. So it's win-win. Angel paradox. Unfortunately, let's go back to 1932 when Sir Norman Angel won the Nobel Peace Prize for his insight that if two interdependent economies are at war, sanctions have the effect of causing both to lose. And we obviously see this in the United States, where U.S. Treasuries are now AA instead of AAA, and where the sanctions are causing inflation. And do we see this in Europe, where the loss of Russian gas, which Europe and especially Germany were very dependent on, is deindustrializing the European economy at speed, leaving Germany very, very vulnerable as, for example, VW, who's never ever closed a plant, is now closing plants in Germany because they're just not competitive without cheap gas. So angel paradox is important. If you might think you can get away with sanctions, you're only going to win and your target's going to lose. But it doesn't work that way because you undermine commercial certainty, you undermine confidence, you undermine the forms of commerce that we all depend on. Resiliency, stability, and inflation. There's actually a good chance that as countries experiment with backing their currencies with gold and other reserves, sometimes commodity reserves, that they actually bring down inflation, make themselves much less vulnerable. In Ghana introduced a gold-backed currency last year, and inflation dropped from about 170% to 22%, which, 22% is still pretty stonking inflation, but it's a lot better than 170%. And other countries, like I think it was Mali this week, or announced that they would be, instead of shipping their gold to France, as they've done during the imperial period, keeping their gold at home, refining the gold at home, and using it to create a reserve. And that can help stabilize the economy and make it more resilient to shocks, for example. So gold returns as a hegemonic asset. There was record buying of gold by central banks in 23, and that's actually accelerated, even though the price has gone up in 2024. Poland has now surpassed the United Kingdom in gold reserves, which they announced practically dancing about because they're so happy about it. And of course, so it's not just rivals of the United States buying gold, like China, which certainly has a lot of gold, but even Poland, which has always been very closely aligned with the United States. Technology and infrastructure. A lot of things are possible now that weren't possible 20 years ago or 25 years ago. As somebody who builds global capital markets, I can do things now that were unthinkable 25 years ago. And I can do them at a very, very low cost because cloud technology and modular applications mean that we can create actually quite complex optionality through technology and have it be real time with low latency available globally. That's a huge, huge, huge advantage for a more complex world. Every major bank does business in multiple currencies. Every major corporation does business in multiple currencies. But now even you and I can do business in multiple currencies. I can bill someone in any of 34 currencies on PayPal, 19 on Wise, 27 on WeChat Pay. So that even a small business now has multi-currency options. The thing that keeps me up and worries me, debt. The debt overhang is now so huge. And Europe, the United States, Japan are so dependent on debt. So for example, in the United States, 8% of GDP is financed by increasing the deficit. They're at 36 trillion in debt now. And they're now paying, the interest they pay is the largest line item in the budget. Historically, that hasn't ended well. And so what I do worry about is how we transition without creating a debt crisis that destabilizes the global economy that depends on stable currencies, on stable assets like US treasuries, bunds, gilts, trésors, JGBs. I don't have the answer for that one, but that is, I think, the biggest challenge. And then finally, I'm an optimist. Better is possible. I do think that this world is going to be better for most of the 8 billion people on the planet. Yes, we've got coups. My goodness, we had 3 coups last week. Well, 4 if you count Syria. Although I think that was a little not really a coup because it was external actors. Al-Qaeda are now the good guys. And they're called rebels, even though none of them is Syrian, which I find very strange. Anyway, point being that yes, we've got these destabilizing events around the world, but the outcomes for most people could be that they live better, the economies are more stable and more resilient to shocks, and that trade grows because of the optionality of doing trade in more currencies, and particularly with China and Russia, long-term deals that stabilize prices and have a long-term impact on inflation. So I'll leave it there.
Well,
I'll
thank
let
you so much, Kathleen, for in the end an optimistic presentation and at least a very thought-provoking and fascinating. I look forward to feedback from Paolo and Johannes. Paolo, if I can give you a chance first to respond to Kathleen's interesting views.
Yes, thanks, Paul, for giving me the floor, and thanks to Cosmolab for organizing this event and having me here, and thanks to Kathleen for starting brilliantly this session, this discussion on multi-currency mercantilism. I have to say, well, I would like to start just saying a couple of things about Kathleen's book. I think that I read it. I think it is concise, dense, and I like the way Kathleen pulls together topics that are too often focused separately. And I refer to the transformation of the oil and gas markets, the digitalization of financial systems, and sanctions and debt. Or also the gold market, to name just a few. So it's greatly combined all these topics in one single discussion. And multi-currency mercantilism, I think, depicts one of the possible trajectories defining our future. So it's quite important. And it's a trajectory that we have already started to follow, I think. And the basic idea is that we are entering a new phase of globalization where the monopoly of the US dollar is progressively fading, and for necessity is opening to a diversified and more balanced setting in the realm of international use of currencies, specifically the use of currency for trade settlement. And this will help to stabilize the world economy, as Kathleen well explains. And also diminishing the dependency on one single currency. So I think that Kathleen is very positive regarding this point, and she suggests that we are beginning a phase of, well, a more optimistic and collaborative world. If I remember well the words that she said, that she uses. And I think that we are all hope for the better for this. So before going deeper into some specific details of the multi-currency mercantilism and the conditions and the overall situation, I think that there is one point that Caroline raises that is quite interesting. So she says that in the book that there is this alternative experience brought by the BRICS Plus countries that they are developing in terms of global governance. And I think that, yes, if I remember well, Kathleen uses the term holacracy that I found very interesting as a form of decentralized management of the world economy, a real alternative to the idea of an hegemon ruling the world economy. So I think this point deserves much attention because it means that multi-currency mercantilism is not only a matter of economic convenience, but conveys the vision of a different global political and economic system. So multi-currency mercantilism is not really about the declining power of the United States. This is something, it's a narrative that dating back to the 1970s, and not even about the growing power of China challenging and changing the global economic setting. But it's more about the emerging consciousness, I would say, of a concrete possible alternative. So it sparks many questions, and also about potential outcomes from these real alternatives. So, for instance, it could maybe fought in some environments like a new ideological background for the growing confrontation between blocks, even though I don't like much to use this word because I don't think we're living in a world divided in blocks. And so I think I'll leave it here and then go back into the debate with more specific issues about the multi-currency mercantilism. All right.
Great. Thanks so much, Polo. Then before Kathleen responds to you, let me first give Johannes a chance to give his opinion on Kathleen's views on the multi-currency mercantilism.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation to join this really interesting format. So I think I am, so my thoughts are a little bit, so I come from the China perspective, looking at what is kind of China's role in all of this new multi-currency mercantilism, right? And I'm a little bit more skeptical of the notion if this kind of decentralization or fragmentation of the kind of global financial system, how feasible it is and what the possible alternatives are. Right? I mean, for payments, I definitely agree that it's very much possible, and we've seen a move towards certain currencies becoming more important in global trade. But it has been the RMB to a large extent, for instance, right? So it's concentrated in certain currencies to a certain degree. But other aspects where I think it's a bit more difficult is when it comes to financial assets and liabilities, right? As other kind of important aspects of currency multipolarization. Do we really see, I mean, local currency bond markets, for instance, has been something that has been attempted to being built in many countries, especially in Asia, but it hasn't really taken up that much, right? I mean, if you look at international debt, a vast majority of this is still in US dollar. I mean, even kind of the Chinese debt in RMB, although it's much more interesting to invest into RMB or to issue RMB liabilities at the moment due to interest rate differentials. We haven't seen like a decisive shift here, right? Similar to kind of assets, I mean, global stock markets, 60% of global stock markets are the United States by now, right? Which is a different problem, I'd say. I mean, the question is, can we really see a kind of multipolarity in these other areas besides payments? How feasible is that? And kind of when we look at the case of China, what we see is, yes, there has been what China did, or the Chinese authorities did, was to create the necessary infrastructure to potentially enable an increased use of the RMB. But they've done this so in a very, very controlled and gradual way. And a lot of kind of the slow development of RMB internationalization is really deliberate from Beijing, not so much from outside actors. So, I mean, yes, things are changing within China, especially after 2022. But still, there is a certain hesitancy to take on this role of having a greater currency. But there's not too many options to have these kind of currencies that could be kind of major investment currencies or for debt to be issued. So if we don't see this development in the RMB, I'm wondering in how far, besides payments and the transaction of goods, whether when it comes to assets and liabilities, we even have the potential to move away to the dollar as much as in other areas. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Right. Shall I answer these now? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I was just yeah.
I'll just,
I think if you can pick it up right there, Kathleen. Sorry for the delay. Yeah.
I'll take first the point about Paolo's point about holacracy, which is a word that I had never actually come across until I was writing the book. And basically, it means that I think in BRICS terms, they describe it as sovereignty, that each country is sovereign, even small ones, and they can take decisions that are in their own best interest flexibly without being compelled to follow any particular course of conduct. So whereas the Bretton Woods system was imposed top down, with the United States being at the top and the G7 being at the next level, and nobody else really having a say, the BRICS format is very much sovereign, that you do business with who you want to do business with. For example, last year at Johannesburg at the BRICS Summit, India was still having troubles with China. They're very tense relations. It's the only border of China's land border that remains undefined. And they didn't want to do business with China, but they desperately need a super container port because India has a mammoth coastline, but not a single industrial super container port. So instead, they did a deal with Dubai Ports World, which runs super container ports all over the world. And Dubai Ports World will build the first super container port in India. That's the kind of optionality BRICS has, where you do what is in your sovereign interest according to your own lights without being dictated to by some top-down organization like the UN, the IMF, or the World Bank. So I think that's quite an important point in how it differs from the past. And then on Johannes's point on assets and liabilities, I'm someone who builds bond markets, who builds debt markets, repo markets. And I'm very unhappy with what BIS and IOSCO have done to the world. They've issued these top-down regulations, which are inappropriate as market structure for most countries. A small country with an illiquid currency is not going to develop a deep liquid bond market by following BIS IOSCO rules. They'll probably buy a prefab exchange from somebody like NASDAQ and end up completely illiquid. If I were a small country, I would just rip up the IOSCO BIS rulebook, bring in broker-dealers, allow dealers to trade on inventory without being hit by capital, and grow my own internal liquid market using a dealer market with bid-ask spreads for price discovery. And that would, I think, provide a much superior market structure. But unfortunately, we do have this tyranny of the BIS, this tyranny of IOSCO, and small countries feel that they have to go along to be seen as responsible. So they're never going to develop bond markets. I would actually like to fix that. I would like to plumb bond market infrastructure that would work in illiquid small countries. And happily, if anyone wants to finance me doing that, I'm available because it is a long-term problem. It has had an impact. Now, where I do see change, Argentina was able to use swap line on renminbi to pay its debts to the IMF. It didn't have dollars, but rather than default on yet another IMF credit tranche, because Argentina has a bit of a history there, they were able to draw on the renminbi swap line and pay in renminbi because renminbi is one of the IMF SDR, special drawing right, basket currencies. And you can repay an IMF debt in any of those five. So what China has introduced is a bit of optionality to the existing system of debt service. And of course, a lot of countries, Argentina is the IMF's biggest debtor by far. I think Pakistan is number 2. Neither one of them has a great record that debt actually is good for development. So that's another challenge. How do we develop without necessarily it being debt financed? One of the Sahel states, it'll be either Mali or Niger, actually collectively raised the debt to open a tomato canning factory. So they produce a huge crop of tomatoes every year. They used to ship them abroad and then buy the paste re-imported. But now they're canning the tomatoes and making the tomato paste locally, and they did that by raising collective local finance. So that's a positive story that we could see more of. Similarly, one of the Sahel states has decided it's not going to ship its material resources, gold, lithium, whatever, abroad for processing. It's going to do the processing locally. That obviously grows the local economy, creates a higher value-added product, stabilizes trade, gives them more trade capacity. So, yes, it's a long path. As somebody who's worked in this area since 1986, I'm very frustrated with some of the very, very bad regulation that's been forced on markets. So what I do think at some point, some countries need to rethink, do we really want to follow IOSCO and BIS, or do we really want to reassess at first principles what it is we think markets need to do in terms of price discovery and liquidity? Because I'm not convinced IOSCO serves that. I would just tell you a story. When I was young, I did a survey of, I was on the IOSCO working party on secondary markets. I did a global survey of the countries involved as to what the average trade size was on their markets. And I've actually got it here. Now there's something I dug out. London Stock Exchange, the average trade size on the London Exchange for the UK market was 80,000. On the SIAC International market, it was 272,000. Today, the average trade size on London Stock Exchange is 4,000. So they went from being the deepest liquid market in the world to being just as illiquid as everybody else. And that's a huge loss for the world and for London. Germany used to be 46,000, Paris 11,000, Toronto 18,000, New York 70,000, Tokyo 48,000. They now all average 3,000 or 4,000 as an average trade size because of automated dealing. They've lost broker-dealers who did the big trades. So I would actually like to rethink whether we go back to exploring first principles. Do we have the right trade structure regulation? And that's particularly important for emerging and small markets.
Yeah. So, Kathleen, when Johannes thinks that possibly multi-currency mercantilism will not go beyond payment, you disagree? It's just a matter of time before it all plays out.
It depends whether there's a willingness to challenge the sort of tyranny from Basel and IOSCO, because they've massively overregulated markets. When I supervised London Stock Exchange, we had electronic broker-dealers like Globex. We had broker-dealers that ran an open dealing book with bid-ask spreads quoted. We had electronic systems that did small value trades leading into the market on behalf of retail. We had allowed every type of trading in parallel. Any one of those could be a member of the exchange. And now almost all of that variety has been regulated away.
Yeah, in your book, you also mentioned the case of El Salvador, who basically went on their own and did a few unorthodox things, like, for example, building up a Bitcoin reserve. They did get a lot of negative feedback from IMF as well. Could you say a bit more about El Salvador and whether that's something you expect to see more often?
I'm not a crypto bro. I watch with interest. But in Nayib Bukele, obviously, he tore up the rule book, and they went from Nicaragua having the highest murders in the world to the lowest in the South American region, and people, businesses are now going there because he's shown that he's willing to take risks and do things that are unorthodox, but that are pro-business. The Bitcoin reserve is one of those. But Google is putting its South American headquarters there. So it's more broadly, he's reformed the country into someplace safe and predictable in terms of policies, and generally pro-business in terms of policies. And that is paying off, absolutely.
Yeah, and you're not a crypto bro, you say. We also see Trump, though, and his advisors to talk about maybe accumulating more Bitcoin. How do you look at Bitcoin in a multi-currency world? Is it going to play a more prominent role?
Well, Trump is interesting because he's gone from he says in the same week he says that we will put 100% tariff on anyone challenges U.S. dollar, to saying we need a reserve of the single thing that was founded and established to challenge the US dollar, Bitcoin. And it's not clear to me how that reserve really works. It's not going to be, gold is universally valued. You can price it, you can trade it, you can settle it. In fact, if you don't want to hold rubles, you don't want to hold renminbi, you don't want to hold dirham, the way you get out of those currencies is by buying gold for export. Moscow has a gold exchange, Shanghai has a gold exchange, Dubai has a gold exchange. And that's universally accepted. There is no universally accepted Bitcoin exchange. And in fact, more than 50% of all the Bitcoin exchanges ever founded have failed because of management embezzlement, hacking, or fraud. So I'm not going to endorse something with those kinds of risks at this point.
Right. Paolo, you said multicurrency mercantilism is just one of the trajectories. What are, in your view, the other trajectories, the most important ones that we could see happen over the next few years?
Yes, I would say that the multi-currency mercantilism is the positive trajectory. But if we think about in terms, I also mentioned it blocks, and I would say that I do not like much to think in terms of blocks because it reminds me that the first Cold War, and I think that we are very, very far from that reality. I think that reality now is a complex set of different but combined networks that spreads all over the world, all over the economy and the financial system. So the negative, one negative trajectory could be the fact that there is a rigidity coming over this emerging idea of having a more balanced global system. So the reaction of the G7, for instance, of the North Atlantic bloc can be problematic in some areas, and I think that going back to the examples of El Salvador and China, I think that, as a financial geographer, I cannot help but notice that these dynamics, including money flow for trade transactions or also cross-border investments, unfold across space and time in different ways, and importantly under different conditions. So these conditions, I think that are different for all countries involved in the increasing use of local currency trade. If we think of China, for example, we can easily argue that China is now in some sort of an advantage point compared to other countries using alternative currencies. I'm referring to the BRICS Plus countries, of course, not least because its trade volumes and its increasing trade relations with countries in the so-called global south and global east. In some commercial relations, China can define the conditions under which using or not its currency or exchanging commodities for services. And this may not be true for other BRICS Plus countries. Some of them may be forced to use alternative currencies because of sanctions, for instance. And these are not conditions that will last forever. They are, we hope, and they are subject to change. And this means that we are still in some sort of condition of an uncertain future. And we also have to consider, referring to the geographies, consider also the part of Chinese export that are not really Chinese. So those non-Chinese exporters that export from China may have different expectations or different strategies in using a specific currency in trade settlement. So I think that we are still in a moment in which multi-currency mercantilism, despite being a possible future trajectory, and actually a trajectory that has already started, is still in a very embryonic stage. Context and conditions are, I would say, are characterized by deep asymmetries. And I guess I will stop here for the moment. Yeah.
Kathleen, you'd like to respond to that?
Well, I think when I started writing the book in January of 2023, I was very worried. First of all, because the tensions were getting so escalated. But also, I thought there was more optionality, that there were many possible outcomes. We could have World War III. Yay! No, I'd rather not. So, and of course, we have the United States Treasury actually pouring more and more sanctions on the world, trying to force people into dollar against their will. I don't think that's a long-term realistic policy. We'll see. We're going to get a hedge fund manager as the next Treasury Secretary under Trump. That would be a big change from Janet Yellen. We'll see where that goes. Because he's likely to have a more realistic view of the world and what you can force people to do and what's not going to be likely effective leverage. But in general, I think I made a lot of calls right that the monetary mercantilism is emerging. Volumes in SIPs, volumes in that's Chinese renminbi, volumes in Mir, which is the Russian ruble, volumes in UPI, which is the Indian rupee payment system. They're all growing at a strong pace, which indicates that they are actually doing more business in their own currencies. I don't. This is an interesting one. I would love to build the data set that tracks this, because as far as I'm aware, there is no data set that collects aggregate payments data from all of the different payment systems operating in the world. By the way, there are payment systems we don't ever see at all. I was at a SIBOS, a SWIFT meeting once. I was chatting to the head of FedWire from the New York Fed, a former colleague of mine. And I told him that Citibank did 3 times his volume every night in book crossings. And he's like, no, that's impossible. That couldn't be. So we walked across the room to the head of Citibank's payments, and I asked, what volumes are you averaging overnight? And he confirmed it was 3 times FedWire. But that's not published anywhere. You will never see that. If you know it exists, you know it exists. But if you don't know it exists, you don't see it in the flows of payments. That's one reason why I think Trump's plan to punish people for doing non-dollar transactions is ridiculous, because he's not going to see the data. Nobody sees the data. If you're dealing with a concentrated payment system where the payment is being done internally on a book transfer instead of being sent out over the payment lines, nobody sees it. So, I'm sorry, there's a bit of a plumber's view of the world there, but yeah, there's optionality out there. What we can see is consistent growth in payments that are reported.
You agree, Johannes? Maybe there's much more for the eye to see, and this alternative system is already being built without the West realizing it.
I do agree to a certain extent. There's definitely a lot of increasing use of non-US dollar payment system for sure. I mean, but one important difference, I mean, some countries, right? There was a recent IMF study that looked at kind of the RMB share in payments with China, and some countries, and I mean, most European countries in North America, it's less than 5%. In a lot of countries in Asia, it's more than 40, 50%, sometimes 60. Some countries such as Argentina or Chile have 80% almost. So we definitely see a geographical divide here, right? In that a lot of that, the Europe and North America are kind of not part of that shift or not part of that system. But also, if we look at kind of the overall share of the RMB for payments, it's quite small because it's bilateral. It's not. So I mean, there's few cases where, let's say, Argentina would pay Chile in RMB, right? They would rather use the US dollar, maybe by a bilateral, but that's not very often, right? So. So the important thing about the dollar is everyone uses the dollar, although the US is not involved.
Yeah.
And that is both for payments, but also for issuing debt, for instance, right? So I think that's a major difference that we see. That's something that's hard to overcome. I mean, and there was this dispute between India and Russia, right, where Russia wanted to be paid in RMB by Indian refiners who started doing that until the Indian finance ministry said, no, you can't pay them in RMB. And I think they settled on paying in dirham, right? So the UAE currency. But still, there's tensions to that. So basically, yes, we will see more of this bilateralism, and naturally, China will be a huge part of that, just giving its important size in global trade with most countries around the world. But I'm wondering if will we actually see something that transcends these bilateral ties, basically, like the US dollar did before? And that I'm not quite sure about. And if that's the case for payments, how is it then for kind of investing and issuing debt?
Yeah. Yeah. On trade, the trend is obvious. That's why I started with mercantilism, because on trade, China is by far the dominant trade partner for almost every country now. And it was back in 2000, China was the first country to propose a free trade agreement with ASEAN states. And as you say, now ASEAN, those states are interlinked into the Chinese economy and integrated with Chinese supply chains, and it's a very stable ecosystem. Last month, President Xi rescinded tariffs on 39 developing countries that recognize China. So effectively free trade, inviting free trade with 39 very poor countries. Now, it took a while for the ASEAN scale to grow. It's going to take a while for African scale to grow. But he's laying the groundwork for an integrated and stable trade economy. In terms of securities markets and debt markets, well, I'm not sure that that's the right model for a lot of these very poor countries. I mean, obviously you have deep liquid markets in Hong Kong, Singapore, but as you get even within ASEAN, when you get down to Indonesia, Malaysia, they're not very deep anymore. And to me, I would always worry whether that made us vulnerable to instability. Because let's face it, it's not difficult to destabilize small countries. And we saw that in 1999 when the LTCM failure destabilized the entire Asian region, right? And they learned lessons from that. They've built in stability since then so that they weren't as badly affected in 2007, but it would be better if they weren't at risk at all. And you know, some of the new models for corporate ownership coming out of China are actually really interesting. Huawei, you know, the biggest telecommunications operator, builder, manufacturer on earth. Sorry. Yeah, they're owned by their workers. It's a worker-owned cooperative company. Now that, you know, is unthinkable in the West, where we basically force people to IPO at gunpoint, so that Vanguard and Fidelity and BlackRock can own all the shares and any excess profits. But is that the right system for every country? I think actually the optionality of different corporate structures is one of the more interesting things we're seeing play out in the world. Because when, you know, Huawei, when Trump put sanctions on Huawei in 2018, intending to destroy the company, and it did destroy its phone business for a while. Because Huawei was collectively owned, they could increase the research and development budget collectively among themselves without worrying about what the market would think. And they were able to build not only the Huawei Mate Pro 70, which is now the hottest tech item in the world, if you can get your hands on one, but also they built out all of the other parts of the tech ecosystem where they felt vulnerable. So they have their own chips now. They have their own, everything that they used to import from the States, they now make proprietary, and they're sharing that at much lower cost with the rest of the world. When Huawei built the telecom systems in Argentina, Argentina didn't have the money to pay for them. Bit of a problem. Huawei took payment in beef. China eats a lot of beef. Argentina grows a lot of beef. So there was, they came up with a solution that worked for both sides. It turns out the founder of Huawei's son has a food import company. So yay, send all the cattle over there and he'll take care of it. So, I mean, what I find interesting now is just the optionality that's emerging in legal structures and in corporate structures, in trade bartering, where we can move away from everything having to be done the way it's always been done.
And Kathleen, do you still see value in having some sort of global unit of account? Like right now, it's mostly the dollar, but would there be room for an alternative? Keynes talked about the Bancor. We have the SDR at the level of the IMF. Is there room for something like that too?
Okay. You're right that everything is priced in dollars and that will be persistent for a while. It is the unit of account. Whether you want to trade in dollars or not, things are priced in dollars. I mean, if I'm going to quote you a price for something I sell on eBay, I'll quote the price in dollars. But if you want to send me the money over PayPal, I can take any of 34 currencies, right? However, on the idea of the SDR, I frankly think the SDR is now tainted. The last fixing was very ill-transparent. It did not follow the formula that was agreed in 2015. They delayed it 2 years, and then they just published the new weightings without any explanation, no analysis, no reference even to the formula that was adopted by the board in 2015. So the SDR is, I'm afraid, I'm going to say, faces the future of every basket currency. I'm a skeptic that any basket can ever maintain value without manipulation. That it's always in the interest of the incumbents to manipulate the basket. For example, the UK, there's no way the UK, with its massively shrinking economy, should still be in the SDR. The formula adopted in 2015 was on trade, where the UK has lost most of its trade because, well, we lost our biggest market in Europe. And then also credit markets. Yes, okay, there are still capital markets in London, but who does business in sterling? It's not a big demand currency. So I think that sterling probably should have fallen out at the last weighting, but rather than have another Asian currency, because the alternatives would have been Hong Kong dollar. Oops, you can't have two China currencies in one index, can you? Or South Korean won. But rather than have another Asian currency in the SDR, they just kept sterling in. No explanation. So I'm a big skeptic of any basket currency. I think they all get tainted over time.
Clear. Paolo, would you like to chip in?
Yes. Thanks, Paul. I was actually thinking about your previous questions and also about these different conditions and also different scenarios that we can see in the future. And I was thinking that earlier I was more thinking about this potential negative scenario, but now I was thinking instead about potential tensions that can arise within the West, let's say within different actors operating in our European countries or in the United States. For instance, I was thinking about potential tensions that can arise between let's say, governments and big investors, big institutional investors. It relates also to what Johannes said about the difference between trade settlement and financial flows and the financial markets. So especially if we consider the increasing interest that American and European financial markets have developed into what they still consider emerging economies, particularly in China. I think that this kind of tension is already here. It's a tension between, as I said, governments and investors in general, in markets, investment funds, hedge funds that are actually seeking for higher yields from more attractive financial products. Kathleen said, I think she wrote in the book that China's bonds have outperformed the U.S. Treasuries. So this interest into those capital markets will not fade away easily. But anyway, there is already some sort of contrast that I see on the background here. For this reason, I think that there's yes, the next step to understanding multi-currency mercantilism would be dissecting trade from finance. So think of it differently and try to understand how financial markets really work and who are the people who are much in the institutions that are really interested in investing in different currencies and why. So I think, yes, if we want to think about building a more balanced and stable international economic landscape, we really need to look into the financial markets.
Do you see that too, Kathleen? It's like a two steps approach, where first step will be trade, and then second step in parallel or sequential would be trying to also change the financial markets at large and making it more equitable.
Absolutely, there needs to be new infrastructure, because 80 countries took a decision as policy to shift to local currency trade in 2023, but none of them has deep liquid credit in interbank repo markets. As somebody who built tri-party repo, which is now 7.5 trillion a day, I would love to fix that problem. There needs to be infrastructure which provides on-demand liquidity as needed, when needed, where needed, in any currency. That is actually why I founded Pacemaker Global, is to build that. It doesn't exist. And in the existing rentier capitalist system, where it's very highly concentrated in, let's say, the top 20 banks, especially for foreign exchange, if you want to borrow a less liquid currency, you often face a huge spread on the FX, but also a huge credit spread. Like most of Africa will pay 10% more in interest than any country in Europe. And that inequality is baked into the existing financial system, the existing banking system. And that inequality needs to be addressed with new infrastructure. It doesn't have to be a new currency, a Bancor or a BRICS currency. What it has to be is infrastructure that brings optionality to get your credit when you need it in whatever currency you need.
Yeah. Johannes, I see you nodding. Would you like to weigh in?
Yes, no, I mean, I totally agree with the point that Kathleen made. I think the Enbridge project is a very interesting example here, right? Where you have this kind of multi central bank digital currency platform that has been built by Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thailand, China, the UAE, and now Saudi Arabia has also kind of joined as well, which is interesting because you can have these kind of different currency pairs of the yuan or dirham or kind of a trade with each other. So that's an interesting kind of mechanism to circumvent that kind of central unit of account.
Enbridge is kind of painful for me because as much as I would like them to succeed, I don't think they will. Because nobody in the world has ever wanted a payment versus payment, currency versus currency payment. It's just not something that the world can use. And in fact, I went and visited HKICL, which is managing the project, and I asked, I got briefed on Enbridge, brought up to date, and I asked the COO, "What's the use case for this?" And she said, "We've asked the banks to tell us." I'm sorry, that's not the way I build a project. If I'm building plumbing for the world, I start with a problem and I solve the problem. But PVP payment, what do they call it? Atomic settlement. Woohoo! On blockchain is not solving any problem that exists in the real world. And I'll say this with great confidence because there was another company here in London founded by the founder of WorldPay to do exactly the same thing. They've spent many tens of millions trying to do it, and they haven't found a use case either. So I'm sorry, but PVP atomic settlement doesn't have a use case. No bank's back office is set up to manage it. No correspondent banking back office is set up to manage it. No corporate treasury is set up to manage it. And you just can't reverse engineer the entire world because you've built something that you like. So if I were building it, I would have done some things quite differently. I like to build for the real world so that I get bank adoption as I progress.
Okay, that's clear. Well, we are slowly but surely going towards the end of the conversation. I want to give Paolo and Johannes, of course, one more time to ask Kathleen a question. I want to have my own final question, which would be, you talked in the book about that the transition can be stable and gradual, but with more wars, it can also be stabilized and accelerated. I think the number of conflicts is growing rapidly. We just addressed what's going on in Syria. It seems the world is getting becoming a more and more dangerous place. So let's say we are not going to see a stable and gradual transition, but we're going to see something more intense. Could you paint a picture, like what the scenario will be like if we're going to have a accelerated transition? How would it look like especially for us in the West, for example, for Europe, for the Netherlands?
Oh, goodness. I wish this wasn't a question that we needed to deal with, but we do. Yes. We've had 10 years of this narrative of autocracy versus democracy. And then as soon as people start getting elected that we don't like, suddenly there's an auto coup in South Korea. There's an auto coup in Romania that just cancels the election. And then we have all of these Ukrainians and Europeans being bussed into Georgia to pretend that there's a revolt in Georgia. It's just sort of silly. Obviously, we don't actually care about democracy. That's not what's been going on. It's been about control and about putting everybody under the control of EU and NATO. And if they don't like EU and NATO, suddenly they're the enemy and we cancel their election. And yesterday, they actually cut off the electricity and telecoms to Georgescu's house, which, really, how to reinforce that we don't want him for president. He had 63% of the projected vote. But nope, we'll just cancel the election, cut off the electricity, and pretend he doesn't exist, which is really mad. I would not have had that on my bingo card for this year. So, I mean, what's interesting is just the amount of unanticipated things that are happening. Last month, would any of us said that Israel, the US, and Turkey would finance Al-Qaeda? And that Al-Qaeda could get into Syria and take the whole country in 1 week. It's just, that's not something any of us anticipated. But it is changing the world. It's absolutely going to change the world. It's certainly concentrating Iran's mind, I should think. But not just Iran. China will need to secure itself being surrounded on all sides. And other countries will want to preserve the prosperity they've built over decades from random, unplanned destruction. So, yes, war accelerates what's happening because it makes people take choices that are defensive. And if you think that most of the world's, say 7 billion out of the 8 billion people on Earth are within the group that want to defend their ability to grow and prosper together, I think it probably accelerates the isolation of the US, Europe, and Japan, and probably South Korea. And what's interesting is if you look at their economies from 2022 to 2024, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan are now all in recession. And demand for their goods, particularly in critical markets like China, has cratered. So that, for example, Chinese are buying every brand of Chinese cars. Every single brand of EV in China is profitable, even the Tiji ones. But there's been a collapse in them buying Toyotas. Because why would you buy cars from a country that's just given the US 3 new missile bases to point missiles at you? And similarly with Australia, China used to import its iron and other critical materials from Australia, because what else has Australia got? But China is now importing those goods through Belt and Road Initiative countries in Central Asia and from South America. Because why would they trade with Australia when Australia is determined on their destruction? So yeah, it's the world is thinking a lot harder about national security issues, and I think currency optionality is part of that. When I was in Singapore in September, it was the first time I made this statement, that currency optionality is now economic and national security. But everybody in the room nodded, because they really do feel it now, where they didn't feel it 5 years ago.
Thanks, Kathleen. Johannes, I saw you nodding too, so perhaps your final question, and then Paolo gets a final turn, and we can wrap up.
All right, thank you. Yes, I wanted to get back to one of the things that we discussed before. I tried to tie together a few things. We talked about the different kind of corporate structures, right? In, let's say, the West and countries such as China or Russia. And we kind of recently did a kind of study where we looked at kind of different ownership types in kind of large stock markets. And it's quite striking to see these differences between, let's say, the US or UK, like 80, 90% of the market are owned by institutional investors. Then there's a much larger role for corporations, right? So kind of strategic cross-shareholdings in India, in Russia and China, but also in Brazil to a certain degree. And of course, the state holding a larger share, and kind of foreign and institutional investors less. And I was wondering, and we talked about this idea of, mercantilism being a kind of based around the notion of the states rather than kind of private actors, right? I was wondering in how far you see this, because there is this whole intellectual or kind of academic debate over kind of what is often kind of termed state capitalism, in a very kind of neutral term, just as an analytical category to say that in certain economies, the state has a much larger role in kind of steering industrial capacity and ownership and so on, versus kind of a neoliberal model where it's really much more about private profit and the state kind of enables that, in other words, takes a back seat. So when we look at kind of a lot of the countries in kind of the global south, we do see that kind of divide with kind of a larger role of the state within the economy. And these countries have also been the ones that are more engaged in that kind of mercantilism as against to, let's say, a lot of kind of European countries or Canada, for instance, right, in North America. So we do see that kind of these different kind of state market configurations, if you will. And I was wondering if you kind of share the view that this is one of the main dividing lines that we do see here. And kind of related to that, we talked about some of the kind of international organizations and regimes that kind of stabilize the current system, such as IOSCO, BIS, the Korean won being not included into the SDR basket, largely because there are a lot of restrictions on trading the Korean won, right? That is one of the main reasons why also MSCI says it's still an emerging market and so on. So exactly. So my question, first of all, do you also think that it's kind of state market, these different state market configurations that you see in countries and different understandings of what the role of each is the main dividing line that we see here, and how this interplays with these international organizations which entrench the kind of incumbent institutional structure?
We're at an interesting junction where we're going to see a lot of experimentation. So, for example, the Sahel states that were all kept very, very poor by France as part of the French Empire. And in fact, even they exported all the gold to France, which sits in the Banque de France, and they were given credit in franc Afrique on the Banque de France's books. So even the money remains in Paris. And they had no sovereignty, and all of the exploitation was done by French companies that got the rents. Well, now they're booting out the French companies. They are renationalizing the mines and keeping the gold home. And we're going to see some experimentation around there. The IMF for 70 years. The IMF has told countries they must open their economies, they must allow private investment. And what that usually meant was that they grew non-food crops. They grew cash crops like cocoa and coffee for export, and their people didn't have enough to eat. But we're seeing in Ethiopia and in other countries, I think Nigeria, where Chinese are coming in and bringing technology, bringing their agricultural technology, which is the best in the world. China has, almost a quarter of world population and 8% of arable land, and they've managed to produce enough. So they're bringing those incredible technologies, with drones for agriculture and monitoring crops, whatever, into Africa, and that's going to be transformative. We won't necessarily see it in corporate bottom lines. We'll just see it in better fed people and more stable economy. Because if food security is national security. And the IMF World Bank model was always to undermine food security, to leave countries insecure deliberately so that they'd be more vulnerable to destabilization if they got out of line. And so if they now are growing their own crops and have more stability, have more security, that's going to make a long-term difference. In terms of public-private ownership, I think it very much depends on what kind of resource economy you have. Whether you're, in countries very heavily dependent on mining, like Russia, where it's basically mining oil and gas, the state-owned enterprises like Gazprom are dominant. But what I'm kind of watching is Russia in the last 20 years since Putin took power has built up an agriculture economy that's amazing. It's grown to be the #1 food exporter in the world. When Putin came to power, it was a food importer. Once again, it had lots of resources, but it couldn't feed its people because that's what we like. But now Putin took it as a matter of policy to expand agriculture, and they keep expanding it east. They've got a lot of land that hasn't been used. And they are now growing agricultural exports at a really rapid rate. So, and of course, they're shipping that south and feeding the global south. Sometimes they don't even charge for it. So that's a very interesting model where, a state-directed policy has led to abundance of food in the world that we've never experienced before. So I think there's always it's like, what is money? Nobody can describe money because money is backed by different things in every single country of issue, right? And different policies and different tolerances and different risks. So there's no one definition of money. And I don't think you can definitely say that private sector is better than public sector under all conditions. I think it's a matter of local policy.
Thank you, Kathleen. Paolo, your closing remarks or question to Kathleen?
Yes,
or to Johannes, of course.
Yes, I have a question, if I may. I would like to go back to technology and financial infrastructure. So when we were talking about the central bank, digital currencies and atomic settlement, and I think that technology is not neutral, and as money is not neutral. And I'm totally with you when you say that atomic settlement will not help population to resolve, a set of economic problems. And so I wanted to ask you, what kind of technology for what kind of financial infrastructure would you want to see? Like, do you have an example in mind that you can share?
I'm chief executive of it. What I want to do is expand the tri-party repo system, which I built with Clearstream, to serve every other currency. And that's what Pacemaker is founded to do. I want every currency to be liquid in interbank markets so that every bank has optionality on at least short-term repo borrowing of a currency that they need to make a settlement when they need to make it at a cost that is reasonable and with the risks well managed.
Great. I see Paolo nodding. Well, Kathleen, I would like you to give you the final words. Perhaps you could also say something about the biggest challenge that you saw for mankind, which is the debt loads, even though it's very difficult to unwind that. But I'd like to thank you first and foremost for your insights, and also, of course, Paolo and Johannes for their participation and incredible insights too. And of course, Cosmolab and the China Knowledge Network for organizing and hosting this webinar. But Kathleen, perhaps for you to end this conversation and give us some final insights.
Well, first of all, thank you, Cosmolab, and Paolo and Johannes. I hope it's been a good conversation for all of us. It's a big world. There's a lot going on, and I struggle every day to keep up with it. But my baseline is that I'm optimistic that most people want to get along, most people want to do business, most people don't mind if their neighbor prospers while they prosper. And so the world that we're seeing is breaking down the sort of barriers to prosperity that used to limit growth in Africa, South America, Asia. And they're doing it by really collaborative and non-compulsory means, instead of at the point of a gun. So I'm actually quite optimistic about that as a model. It is hard to monitor because there is no central source for it. Mark knows I live on Twitter, X, because that's the only way you can see it unfolding in real time. Because in general, the media is still not covering it. I remember that there was I was watching real time when President Xi did two amazing things on 9th of December 2022. First, he did a face-to-camera presentation where he said Palestine must be a state, 1967 borders, capital at Jerusalem. Now, to me, I thought, this is amazing. This is big. And then in the afternoon, he invited the 7 heads of state who I'd never, ever seen in a room before to trade oil and gas in Shanghai for renminbi. And I thought, that's massive. The world's changed. Guess what? I kept watching every day for a week. Zero coverage in the FT, Bloomberg, Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, Economist. Zero coverage. And that's when I knew that the world we're allowed to see in Western media narrative is not the world that's actually rolling out. So that's why I'm on Twitter X, and that's why it's a challenge to actually be accurate and pragmatic about describing that the world is changing.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to all. Have a good day, and I look forward to staying in touch.